Well, hi, I'm Dr. Peter Murano, and I'm going to discuss today split routine strength training. And the title of the presentation is When Good Intentions Collide with Aging Biology. The information presented in this video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. The AMPK mTOR method is a conceptual framework designed to discuss exercise, nutrition, and metabolic health in a general educational context. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider before beginning any new exercise program, dietary approach, fasting protocol, or supplement regimen, especially if you have a medical condition, are taking prescription medications, or have concerns related to aging, metabolism, or chronic disease. I'd like to start by saying that many older adults who strength train today are doing something profoundly right. They are refusing to accept muscle loss as inevitable. They show up to the gym, they lift, and they push against resistance. But there is an important refinement that must be made, because as we get older, effort alone is not enough. The body responds not just to what we do, but how it interprets the signals we send. Make no mistake that effort matters, but here is the part that requires careful thought. Effort alone does not guarantee outcome. Two individuals can apply the same effort, follow similar routines, and yet experience very different results, especially as they get older. So the issue is not whether effort is present. The issue is whether the effort that is being interpreted correctly by the body. And that is where the discussion begins. Now, I do want to get to talking about split routines as a training modality because they are interesting and important to discuss, but first I have to go through some foundational information. And this slide says the key shift with aging that we need to understand. And as we age, the central question shifts in a very important way and is not anymore simply how often should I train. It becomes more like what signal am I sending when I train and how is my body interpreting it? Because muscle does not respond to effort in isolation. It responds to a combination of factors, including recovery, repair, and timing. You see them on the slide there. Now, in younger people training, these systems are pretty forgiving, but as we get older, they are far more sensitive, which means that the same training pattern that once worked can begin to work against us. Now, what we just left with on the previous slide is pretty sobering thought that something that used to work when we were young can actually backfire if we try to apply it when we're older. So now let's consider what this slide is talking about. What happens when strength training is performed day after day, even if we are rotating muscle groups, so split routines, in other words. Now, from the outside, it appears logical. You might think, I'm not overtraining, I'm giving each muscle group time to rest. And the body, though, is not interpreting this at the level of individual muscles like we think. It's interpreting it systematically, or systemically even. And when resistance training occurs repeatedly across consecutive days, the organism as a whole, meaning us, can remain in a persistent build state. Now, here's the problem with that. Repair processes, especially autophagy, require space. They require time. They require contrast. They require time when the body is not being told to build. And when that space is not provided, the result is subtle but important. Recovery will slow down, adaptation will become weaker, and the return on effort will decline. Now, what we're calling the foundational takeaway on this slide is this. The goal in later life is not to stay busy in the gym. It is to age stronger, more resilient, and metabolically healthier. And that requires more than effort alone. It requires alignment with how the aging body actually adapts. And when training is structured with that biology in mind, effort once again can produce meaningful results. Now, this is where the discussion becomes more nuanced because we have to hold three truths together simultaneously. First, many older adults do not stimulate muscle growth strongly enough. Their resistance training is too light, or their protein intake is insufficient, and this leads to muscle loss, not muscle gain. Second, emerging research shows that aging muscle can also suffer from something very different and surprising: chronic anabolic dominance, where growth signaling becomes poorly regulated and is turned on all the time. And third, the AMPK mTOR method introduces the concept of signal clarity, that not just the presence of signals is important, but separating them in time is what matters. So if we isolate any one of these, we get an incomplete picture. Instead, it's only when we hold all three together that the full problem and the full solution becomes clear. And this is where the work of Dr. Hongwen Tang becomes extremely important, and I've discussed his work, his research, in detail in an earlier video presentation on my site here called New Research on Aging Muscle, so you might want to check on that. And traditionally, we've thought of aging muscle as understimulated, right? That it simply needs more growth signaling, but Dr. Tang's research suggests something more complex. And in many cases, aging muscle is not suffering from too little signaling, but from too much, or more precisely, from signaling that is no longer well regulated. So it's not that the person is training excessively necessarily, it's that their metabolism, and particularly this mTOR signaling, is out of whack. So that's a very different problem, and it leads to a very different approach as an attempted solution. So let's talk a bit about mTOR, and more accurately, mTOR complex 1. And when this complex's signaling becomes unrestrained, several downstream effects begin to emerge. Autophagy, the cellular cleanup process, is suppressed. Senescence pathways become activated, and muscle quality begins to decline. So these are all negatives. And here is what makes this particularly deceptive. Protein synthesis can still be occurring. So from the outside, it may appear as though everything is working. But internally, the system is losing balance. And over time, that imbalance reduces the effectiveness of your training. So in aging muscle, the problem is often not a lack of growth signals, but chronic overactivation of them. When that signal remains constantly elevated, the repair processes that maintain muscle quality are suppressed, and adaptation becomes less efficient. So I've been wanting to talk about split routines since I started the presentation, and now's my chance. And these are extremely common in training, and the idea is to train different muscle groups on different days. It feels logical, it feels structured, disciplined, and efficient, doesn't it? I really think that there is clear logic here, increasing the training volume, reducing local fatigue, and allowing some muscles to rest while others are trained. It's sort of a muscle training rotation, if you think of it. And for many people, especially younger individuals, this kind of logic can work, which is exactly why it has become so widely adapted, split routines. However, there is a mistake here, and this approach assumes that local muscle rest is the same as whole body recovery. And that's the mistake, because in older adults, that assumption often breaks down. The body continues to receive repeated build signals across consecutive days of the week, even when different muscle groups are trained. So addressing the question now as to why split routines work with younger age people, in the younger or highly trained individual, recovery systems are robust, signaling pathways are tightly regulated, and the body can handle frequent input without losing balance. So when one muscle group rests, that rest is meaningful, and adaptation proceeds efficiently. But the same assumption that local rest equals recovery does not always hold as we age, and that is where the breakdown begins. And the key distinction here is simple but profound, and it is this: local muscle rest is not the same as systemic rest. Even if you are not training your legs today, your body is still experiencing the hormonal and molecular effects of resistance training from yesterday. mTOR signaling is elevated system-wide. Autophagy is suppressed across tissues, and the organism, you and me, remain in a build state. So while the program appears varied, the signal remains fairly constant. So a 5-day split routine in older adults creates 5 consecutive mTOR biased days with no rest in between, and even though different muscles are being trained, the person as a whole continues to receive a repeated build signal, limiting the opportunity for repair and recalibration. So if you recall the research of Tang et al., this is where it becomes relevant. If aging muscle already tends toward elevated mTOR activity and we layer on repeated training without interruption, we begin to see a pattern emerge. The system never fully resets. Repair processes never fully complete. And what looks like discipline begins to quietly undermine adaptation. And gradually, this blunts the body's responsiveness to training. More work yielding less return, not more. What is needed is not additional stimulation, but restored contrast between phases of building and repair. In the short term, these split routines can produce some gains, but over time, the absence of true recovery rears its ugly head and leads to a different outcome. Autophagy remains suppressed, cellular cleanup is incomplete, and adaptation efficiency declines. And this is when people begin to say, I'm doing more, but I'm getting less out of my workouts. We should say that mTOR should be activated strongly and purposefully, yes, but episodically, not habitually. It is the separation between activation and recovery that allows each phase to do its work fully and restores the body's responsiveness to training. This leads us to a true paradox, and it is this: aging muscle suffers when growth signaling is insufficient, but it also suffers when growth signaling is constant and poorly regulated. Both are true. And when signaling is too low, muscle is lost. When it is constantly elevated, the system loses its ability to reset, repair, and respond effectively. This is where split routine training can become misleading. When individual muscles may rest, the body as a whole continues to receive repeated build signals across consecutive days, reinforcing the very imbalance that aging system struggles to regulate. In discussing how the AMPK-mTOR method resolves the situation, it's not by choosing one signal over the other, but by separating them. It creates clear phases: days of strong anabolic signaling and days of repair, cleanup, and metabolic rest, or reset. And this separation restores balance. By giving each signal its own time and space, the method prevents overlap and interference, allowing both growth and recovery phases to operate more efficiently and effectively. Over time, this restores the body's ability to respond to training rather than to resist. Now, with aging, we need to have an understanding about blurring signals versus clear signals, because aging brings along with it reduced anabolic sensitivity, higher baseline stress, and more biological noise. Older systems, in fact, stall when signals blur. So without clear separation of AMPK and mTOR, these competing signals interfere with one another to a certain extent, and the body will fail to fully engage either growth or repair. Now, restoring signal clarity restores direction, allowing each process to proceed effectively. So this has been said over and over, and I'll repeat it here on this slide as the core principle that's at work. Aging muscle does not need more signaling, it needs clearer signaling. When signals are well defined and properly timed, the system can respond with precision. It is not the quantity of stimulation that drives adaptation, but the clarity and separation of the signals being delivered. So what does all this mean in practical terms? It means we must move away from patterns that create constant signaling, such as 5 consecutive days of resistance training, or the idea of training something every day. These approaches feel productive, but they often undermine long-term adaptation. For example, a traditional bodybuilding split, chest on Monday, back on Tuesday, legs on Wednesday, shoulders on Thursday, arms on Friday, appear to provide recovery, but in reality create 5 consecutive days of systemic anabolic signaling, mTOR in other words. Even upper-lower splits performed on back-to-back days can produce a similar effect, where the body never fully exits the build state. What feels like smart programming then is at the muscle level, however, becoming chronic stimulation. You want better options? Well, let's talk about them. So more effective strategies are going to emphasize separation and recovery. Full body or upper-lower training performed on non-consecutive days will allow for clear anabolic signaling followed by true recovery. This restores the rhythm that the body needs. For example, a full body program performed 3 times per week, 3 days per week, such as Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, creates distinct mTOR activation days, separated by recovery or AMPK focus days. This allows the system to fully process each stimulus before the next one is introduced. Similarly, an upper-lower split performed 4 days per week, such as Monday, upper body, Tuesday, lower body, Thursday, upper body again, and Friday, lower body again, provides built-in recovery spacing, preventing continuous systemic stimulation while still allowing adequate training volume. So the alternation model formalizes this. mTOR days are dedicated to strength and protein intake. AMPK days, on the other hand, emphasize endurance, metabolic work, and repair. The key is not less activity. We are exercising on both of those types of days, but differently, and there's different intent, therefore. And interspersed within this pattern are true rest days, where the focus shifts fully to recovery, adaptation, and system-wide recalibration. These are not missed training days, which someone who's engaged in a split routine might think. They are the periods in which the work of prior sessions is consolidated. So together, mTOR days, AMPK days, and rest days create a complete rhythm, one that allows the system to build, repair, and reset without interference. Allow me to clarify more regarding AMPK, exercise, and rest. AMPK days are not rest days in the traditional sense. They are active, but the purpose shifts, the intention shifts from building to restoring, and that distinction is critical. AMPK days are still training days, but they are not designed to drive maximal growth signaling. They are not heavy strength training days, in other words. Instead, they emphasize movement patterns and activities that promote metabolic health, circulation, and cellular repair without adding excessive anabolic stress. So this includes activities such as brisk walking, cycling, light boxing, resistance bands, and body weight exercises, either outdoors or in the gym. The body remains active, you see, the heart rate will become elevated, and energy expenditure will be meaningful, but the intent is fundamentally different. It's not an all-out strength training workout at all. So activity does remain high, but intent changes, and on these days, the goal is to facilitate recovery, enhance mitochondrial function. We haven't talked about that in a while, and support processes like autophagy, rather than to push strength or overload the system. And in doing so, AMPK days create the contrast that allows subsequent mTOR days to be more effective, because the system has actually reset and become responsive again. I think it's a good time to review fiber types and purpose, and I did cover this in detail on another presentation, but here's an opportunity again. So different days recruit different fiber type systems, and these are muscle cells. They're called muscle fibers. AMPK days emphasize type 1 fibers and mitochondrial function and endurance capacity, all of that on an AMPK day, whereas mTOR days emphasize type 2 muscle fibers, strength, and protein synthesis go along with that. And the type 1 fibers, back to them, are your endurance and survival and longevity fibers. They are highly fatigue resistant, rich in mitochondria, and essential for sustained activity, metabolic health, and overall resilience. They support daily movement, cardiovascular efficiency, and the ability to remain active over time. Type 2 fibers are your power and protection fibers and longevity, but in a different way. They generate force, preserve strength, and are critical for maintaining independence. Things like getting up from a chair, catching yourself when you trip, or lifting and carrying objects. These fibers, type 2, are the most vulnerable to aging and the most quickly lost without proper training. So if you see an older person, age 60 or more, they are in a type 2 fiber deficit, most likely, unless they've been training properly and consuming adequate protein. Now, when both systems, fiber types 1 and 2, are trained appropriately, you preserve not only strength, but also durability. And I'm talking about training the AMPK and mTOR alternation way. Metabolic health is also a factor included, and functional capacity here. The goal is not to choose one, just AMPK or just mTOR, but to maintain both. And we can say that in terms of fiber types too. We need both type 1 and type 2 fibers because each supports a different essential aspect of long-term capability. Well, there's a lot of detail and complexity actually on this slide. The regulatory benefit, preserving upstream control. AMPK dominant days, I'll say it this way, help restrain excessive anabolic signaling, while mTOR days deliver growth in a controlled, appropriate context, and this restores what is called upstream balance. AMPK dominant days favor something called FOXO-associated programs, and these are pathways involved in cellular repair, stress resistance, and quality control, FOXO being a transcription factor, which means it's a regulator that turns on genes involved in repair and stress resistance. Now, these signals act as a counterbalance to mTOR, preventing the chronic overactivation observed in aging muscle. And we're thinking back again to the findings of Tang et al., where dysregulated mTOR activity was linked not only to persistent anabolic signaling in aged muscle, but also to upstream transcriptional changes involving regulators such as what Tang studied, DEAF1, DEF1, suggesting that the problem extends beyond signaling intensity to impaired control at the regulatory level. And that's a mouthful. I appreciate that. But mTOR days, what can we say? By contrast, mTOR days deliver a strong anabolic signal, but only after repair processes have been allowed to occur. This ensures that growth signaling is received in a system that is prepared for it, prepared to respond, rather than one already saturated with continuous anabolic stimulation. Now, just to clarify here what is meant by what we said, upstream balance. That refers to the proper regulation of the signaling and transcriptional systems, both, that govern cellular behavior. Particularly here, the interaction between mTOR-driven growth signals and AMPK/FOXO-mediated repair pathways. So when this balance is disrupted, as suggested by altered regulators such as DEF1 in aging muscle, the system loses its ability to modulate these competing demands, resulting in persistent signaling, reduced repair, and diminished adaptability. And again, that research by Tang et al. Was in aging muscle where this was observed. Now, by alternating AMPK and mTOR dominance, the system regains control at this upstream level, allowing signals to be sequenced rather than overlapped and restoring effective adaptation. So this slide we're referring to as a foundational takeaway, and it is the alternation restores signal contrast and signal contrast restores adaptation statement. And that contrast is created how? By separating AMPK phases of repair and metabolic work from mTOR-driven phases of growth and protein synthesis. In other words, the separation allows each signal to be received clearly as well as fully. Now again, there's a lot of complexity here, so if you're a trainer, if you're a coach, how would you explain this type of information to your clients? I think that we could say something along these lines. Muscles need time to build, and they also need time to repair. And if we only build, the system becomes overloaded. If we alternate, the system improves. And what does this have to do with split routine training? Well, as we've shown, you can be training 5 days a week using a split routine, and that can overload the system. So think of it this way. Training is the signal, but recovery is where the result happens. Without enough recovery, each new session adds stress without completing the previous adaptation. And when we alternate properly, each build phase is followed by a true repair phase. So the next session starts from a stronger, more responsive place. So if you're training older clients and you have someone come in and they're expressing an interest in considering a split routine of training, different muscles on different days, in other words, well, we can say it feels like each muscle is resting if we do that throughout the week, but the body as a whole is still being asked to build every day. That's the key. So instead of alternating between build and repair, the system that way with a split routine is going to stay in continuous build mode, which is not desirable, especially as we age. And gradually, that reduces the body's ability to recover and respond. So even though you are working hard, progress will be slowed. So to repeat what we've said earlier, this is where split routines can be misleading. You might train chest one day, legs the next, the back after that, thinking you're giving each muscle group time to recover, but your body doesn't see it that way. It receives a build signal every day, so the system never fully shifts into repair mode. When we alternate properly, however, we allow true recovery, and that's what makes the next session more effective. So I think actually we might even like to consider the alternation of AMPK and mTOR training, where we're alternating endurance type aerobic training with strength training, is a type of a split routine in its own way. So I think we can have our cake and eat it too. I do like the idea that the AMPK mTOR method of training is analogous to a split routine traditionally. And what I'm saying is similar but different is that we do not divide the body by muscle groups. when we train with the method, it is regulated instead by signaling systems. So instead of splitting muscles, you are splitting function and physiology. On mTOR days, this is what I mean. The whole body is exposed to a strong, focused growth signal. And on AMPK days, the whole body is exposed to repair, metabolic, and endurance signal. And this creates a true alternation at the system level, something that traditional split routines just cannot achieve. So I would say traditional splits divide the body, whereas the method divides the signal, but we are training full body on alternating signal days. So the purpose is different, but the results should be superior. So regarding doing things right, the goal is not to train harder. As we've been saying, it's to train smarter, to align effort with biology. And this means respecting how the aging body actually adapts by separating strength recovery and metabolic work rather than blending them together. When effort is properly timed and structured, the body can finally respond again. And this includes the older body, so that the work you put in begins to produce meaningful return. So it's when the system is being organized correctly, the effect stops being something you fight through and becomes something that works for you. This is when progress returns. Well, the finish line at last. This has indeed been a long, detailed presentation. And in closing, I would emphasize that when biology is respected, aging becomes something to navigate intelligently, not fight against blindly. It becomes a process you can work with rather than work against. And when effort is aligned with how the body actually adapts, strength, resilience, and function are not only preserved, they can continue to improve. Now allow me to bring this full circle. Split routine training is built on good intentions. You're trying to be disciplined, organized, and consistent, training different muscle groups so each one can recover. And in younger systems, that can work. But as we get older, the biology changes, and the body no longer interprets training as a series of isolated muscle sessions. It responds to the overall signal. And when training occurs day after day, even with different muscle groups, the system experiences a continuous anabolic or build signal. So what feels like recovery at the muscle level becomes actually chronic stimulation at the system level. And this is where the good intentions collide with aging biology, quite frankly. You're doing what seems right, but the body can no longer respond the way it once did. And the result is not more progress, but less. The solution is not to abandon effort, but to organize it differently, to move from continuous stimulation to intentional alternation. Because when we restore that rhythm, build, repair, build again, the body doesn't resist the work. It responds to it. A split routine rotates muscles, but it does not rotate the signal. And in aging biology, that distinction is what matters. Thank you for joining me today. My hope is that you walk away with not just new information, but with a clearer way and approach to your training as you move forward. I'm excited for what this can mean for you as well as for me as we train as older men and women. So take care, and until next time, this is Dr. Pete wishing you all the best.